Hello and welcome back to this Swingman podcast. In today's episode, we'll be talking about the Game 5 win that the Golden State Warriors had over the Boston Celtics, scoring a total of 104-94 at home in the Chase Center. And as always, we'll be breaking it down into two sections: why the Warriors won and why the Celtics lost. So let's not waste any time, let's jump straight into it. Why do I think the Warriors won? For me, from the opening tip, the Warriors seemed like the more aggressive team, and that's probably due to a number of different factors. One of the most important factors being that they are on the road, and it's significantly harder to win on the road, not only with the pressure of the fans, as I mentioned, but you also have to take into account things like travel, time difference, and all that other stuff. However, what I will mention is Draymond Green mentioned this in his podcast, and obviously I can't attest to this, but he did say that the only reason why the NBA is allowing so many rest days is for players to adjust to the change of scenery, the constant change of scenery that you have in a typical playoff series. And this is to make sure that obviously the home team doesn't have the advantage in that regard, making sure that everybody is in quote-unquote 100% shape to be ready to play for this game. So truly, I can't tell you whether it was fatigue that set the Boston Celtics back, but to be realistic, everybody has that challenge if you wanted to make that a specific standout reason as to why they lost that game. Everybody goes on the road for multiple days at a time, and what it comes down to is adjusting to your circumstance. So I can't necessarily say that I can excuse the Celtics for the poor start that they had due to factors like fatigue. And if you watch the game yourself, you would understand what I mean by a poor start, as the Warriors went on a 24-8 run throughout the majority of the first quarter. I think the Celtics did manage to cut it within 10 or 12 points at the half, which is obviously a significant improvement to the initial score differential that they were in. But what I will say is, by going on a shooting slump within the first quarter, they almost set themselves up for failure just because of how much momentum the Celtics gave to the Warriors by not being able to respond when they needed to. And if you've listened to the previous episodes, it might sound like a little bit of a broken record by now, but I keep talking about setting the tone for the game, and that's exactly what the Warriors did. Now what I will say is, and we'll get to it, the third quarter had me a little bit nervous. So I can't exactly say that they set the tone for the rest of the game because of the third quarter. But what I will say is the Warriors obviously established their presence as soon as the ball went up in the air for the tip. And a big part of that, which leads me into point number 2 as to why I thought they won, was the performance put on by recently named All-Star Andrew Wiggins. Last game I mentioned that he had a stellar performance on the defensive end, grabbing 16 boards, which is his current career high, which is actually quite surprising to me given his length and athletic ability, that he wouldn't be able to grab more rebounds than that. Actually, scratch that. Not even the number of rebounds he was able to get. It's more so when he got it. Now, Andrew Wiggins has been in the league for a while. I believe he was drafted in 2014 at the number 1 pick. So he's been in the league for 8 years. Mind you, he was considered as one of the NBA's biggest busts throughout the majority of his career. And it's only until he joined the Warriors where he started establishing a name for himself, if you want to say that. But my point on his rebounding performance was more so that I'm surprised, given the role that he played in Minnesota, that he wasn't able to be on the boards, be a bit more active on the glass. And obviously he was beside a guy like Karl Anthony Towns, who is their best center, their best player. So obviously that's going to set your overall defensive statistics back a little bit. But in my opinion, I think in this role that Andrew's in, he's fitting well into our system. And I'll get onto the theory of our system in a little bit. But I think the role that he's playing right now for the Warriors is the best suited role for him. And you can see him really shine where he needs to shine, as opposed to him being in Minnesota where he was the primary option alongside Karl Anthony Towns. He was asked to do too much and ultimately couldn't perform. So with this new role as the third best option behind Stephen Clay, I think he can really flourish into the aspects that the Warriors lack. Now, if you listen to the last episode of the podcast, Draymond Green spoke about hiding your weaknesses with your strengths. Whereas in this new role, he evens out the playing field, essentially, making sure that we have the size and length to compete against great rebounding teams, which for the most part, we have. Now, obviously, it's quite contrary to what I've been so frustrated about before. But the point I'm trying to make is, I believe that Andrew is a better fit in this system and therefore he gives more effort on both sides of the floor because the Warriors are able to not necessarily exploit but utilize his strengths. And by understanding his strengths, you also understand his weaknesses. So what I think the Warriors have really done great with Andrew Wiggins is by understanding his weaknesses, you are then able to adjust your offense or defense, if that is the case, to the point where you won't have to necessarily rely on Andrew Wiggins to go to the extent of having to show his weaknesses, if that makes any sense at all. So he can sit in a comfortable role where he knows what he has to do, rather than being the primary option and therefore having to exert yourself on both sides of the floor, making your strengths and weaknesses more apparent. Hopefully, you get a sense of what I'm talking about, but I know I chat a lot of mumbo jumbo most of the time. But yeah, we are surprisingly not here to talk about his defensive performance. We're here to talk about his offensive performance. After playing a total of 43 minutes, he racked up 26 points and 13 rebounds to go along with 2 assists. Now, what you probably will say, and for the large part I agree with you, is that they did use him as a primary option in this game. And in all honesty, I thought that Steve Kerr's plan was going to fail, because we've seen what happened in the past with his stint in Minnesota. But surprisingly, he managed to turn it around and actually step up for the team when they needed him the most. Obviously, with Steph not having the best night, which we'll get onto in a minute, he proved that he is a valuable asset within this team on both ends of the floor, really. But I think the thing that impresses me the most is Wiggins really showed you what he's capable of doing with his God-given talents. And that's really what I look for Wiggins to do if they want to close out this series in 6. I really hope that Wiggins can retain this momentum, bring it into Game 6, look to attack the paint, be more aggressive and assertive in the paint, because that's truly where he belongs. Over the course of the game, I was watching his shot selection, and for the most part, I did not agree with some of the shots he was taking. Those shots being long twos and 3-point looks on the wing. Now, what I will say is, yes, he has established himself as not necessarily an elite shooter, but a reliable one, shooting at around the 40% clip, if not just under, from the 3-point arc. So yes, he is one of the most reliable shooters on the team, but athletically, that's not what he was built to do, in my opinion. And I'll put it to you like this. When you look at a guy like Giannis, you don't see him chucking up threes all day, because that is not what he is built to do. And he understands that that's not what he's built to do. So what does he do? He attacks the paint and gets to the line. And arguably the only time that you see his shooting form is at the free throw line, which is exactly what I feel Andrew Wiggins should be doing. He should be looking at a guy like Giannis, not to compare him to Giannis because that would be ridiculous, but just in terms of what his skill set is, it's very similar to what a Giannis can do. So in my opinion, Andrew needs to take a page out of Giannis's book and learn how to attack the paint efficiently. Because although he was scoring the majority of his points in the paint, there were a few times where he was affected by contact, flailing his arms about, and ultimately throwing the ball off the glass too hard. So my advice to him would be, in the summer, when this is all over, learn how to be strong in the paint, learn how to assert your dominance, and watch where you end up in the postseason, because I guarantee you, you will see the Golden State Warriors on that final stage time and time again. Whether that's with the current dynasty in Steph, Clay, and Draymond, or whether that's with the new established core. I'm not going to say dynasty yet because obviously they have to establish themselves as that. The new young core in Jordan Poole, Kuminga, and James Wiseman if he comes back healthy. So now that we've spoken about the main contributor being Andrew Wiggins, let's move on to another reason as to why I thought the Warriors won this game. Coincidentally, it's Steph Curry. Now I know I just said Steph had one of the worst performances he's had in his playoff career, but in actuality, like I said in previous episodes, the stats don't always tell the full story of the game, and that's exactly what happened in Game 5. We'll get onto the vegetables in the later part of the episode, but for now I wanted to talk about the good bits about Steph Curry's performance. The reason why I thought he was able to be so effective despite his lackluster offensive performance was the performance that he had in Game 4. The reason why I say this is because I felt like the Celtics defense was so fixated on what Curry could have done that he was able to give opportunities to those around him. The main contributor obviously being Andrew Wiggins, but he also racked up 8 assists. So it just goes to show you that although he wasn't effective shooting the ball, the sheer gravity of his presence alone on the floor was able to create easier open looks for players who would typically struggle under a heavy contest. So the Warriors obviously capitalized on an otherwise dull situation, but I think this win ultimately proves the depth of the Warriors. They're able to perform even when their star player isn't up to par. So now we're going to move on to our second to last point, and in my opinion it comes in the form of their defense. As I've obviously mentioned, I've given a lot of praise to the Boston Celtics for how tremendously they play on the defensive side of the floor, and it's clear to see that the Celtics, when you talk about defense, are obviously a better team than the Golden State Warriors. But what I saw from them, which ultimately led them to win this game, was more poise. I think the Warriors stuck true to their defensive principles, letting others besides Tatum and Brown really take this game over, letting somebody else beat them. And you could see that besides Tatum and Brown, their next best scorer came in the form of Marcus Smart. And if you can see from the box score, he actually outscored Jaylen Brown by 2 points with an overall score of 20, which is an absolutely respectable number in the finals considering the player that he is. But that's my point. From a defensive standpoint, if you are the Warriors, you have to be happy with that performance and you have to live with that result. That somebody else, apart from Jaylen Brown, who is an efficient, great scorer, scored under 20 points. And somebody like Marcus Smart, who isn't known to be a three-point threat and who isn't known to particularly finish well, was the only guy besides Tatum who beat you. And if you want to mention other factors like Al Horford and Derek White, who were significant in Game 1, they held Al Horford to 9 points and Derek White to just 1. So it goes back to the point that I made in previous episodes about familiarity breeds comfortability. At this point, I feel like players have watched so much film of their opponents, have studied their defensive schemes, their offensive schemes, whatever have you, and they know their plan of attack from the jump. So in that sense, going this many stretches of games is probably a good thing because the players are able to understand who do we want beating us. And in this case, it was players like Marcus Smart, like Al Horford, like Derek White, and for the most part, they did not show up. And if you want to talk about statistics for a second, let me show you this as to why the Warriors are so elite at defense. They held the Boston Celtics to 39 points on 39% at halftime. So you could see that they were clearly applying pressure to their star players, forcing them to give up the ball and making somebody else take the shot, which, as I said before, not many people did. So I tip my hat off to the Warriors defense for showing the Boston Celtics why they are elite and why they were named top 5 in that regard. And so with that, let's move on to my last point as to why the Warriors won this game. To me, the most apparent was their poise and composure, especially during the end of the third quarter, where they were being absolutely obliterated by the Celtics. Typically, if you've watched basketball over the years, especially following the Golden State Warriors, you would know that the third quarter usually belongs to them, in the sense that if they are down in a game, they know how to respond, especially coming out of halftime. But that's not what happened. They went on a scoring drought for about 4 minutes in the quarter, and Boston were absolutely taking advantage of that, lighting them up from 3. And I will mention this for a reason as to why the Boston Celtics ultimately lost this game. But in the third quarter, I am going to be completely honest with you, I thought that the Celtics had regained all momentum and were going to blow the Warriors out from that point forward. The reason why I'm saying this is because after missing their first 12 three-pointers, they hit 9 straight. 9 straight three-pointers to blow the once 16-point lead, 16, out of the water, and then to go up by as much as 4 points in the closing minutes of the quarter. Now, going back to my original point of why I thought that their composure and poise was a factor in them winning this game, is the fact that they didn't let the thought of them blowing a 16-point lead in a pivotal game at home, they didn't let that sort of thought creep into their heads and therefore affect their play. I felt like they showed their veteranship and their overall maturity when compared to the Celtics. Because in my opinion, any other team would have let it slip from that point on. And you've heard about teams blowing leads. The Warriors have obviously been prone to blowing leads in their past, as every team is. But you've also heard of other teams blowing multiple leads in a game. having 2 or 3 leads, and then for them to ultimately lose the game. People often wonder why that is the case. And the simplest way I can explain it to you, or at least I think this is the explanation, has all got to do with confidence. When you have a big lead, especially with one that's as big as the Warriors had, and I'm considering it a big lead simply because the Boston Celtics aren't really known for their 3-point depth, so therefore a 16-point lead is harder to break through if you don't have 3-point shooters who can cut that lead down within 4 to 5 3-point looks. Anyways, when you have a big lead and you see your opposing team slowly breaking it down bit by bit, and I'm talking the bigger your lead is, the worse it feels for you, because it simply proves that your defense is obsolete. And that's not exactly how you want to be feeling when you have that big lead, because it proves that you're not as dominant as you think you are. So let's put it into a different scenario. I'm going to go a little bit off topic here, but hopefully you get my point. In the game that the Mavericks won against the Suns, when they were up by as much as 30 at the half, and Luka Doncic alone had as many points as the entire Suns roster did. If they had come back to win that game in a pivotal Game 7, do you think the Mavericks would have lost that game? My answer is absolutely. The only reason why I say that is because your confidence gets so shattered by the fact that you had such a big opportunity to take the game away with such a massive lead, and you let that go, so you put that burden on yourself if you are a competitive player. And bringing it back to the Warriors, this situation could have easily gone sideways if the point I had made came true. If Steph was to take a burden on himself and say, this is the reason why we blew a 16-point lead, because I'm not good on defense, or should I say, I'm not as good as other players on defense, so therefore I am a liability. And on top of that, I've just missed 4, 5, 6 threes in a row. Good looks that I usually make. I've missed them all. So what if I had made those? Would we have been up by bigger? Would we have maintained the lead? You see how all these questions start to creep up in your mind as soon as you start to take the burden on yourself when you start to lose. And that's natural for star players to feel like that, because ultimately it is their team. So for players like Steph, like Clay, like Draymond, and even some of the young guys like Jordan Poole, who aren't necessarily seasoned to this kind of situation, it can be very easy for them to let doubts creep into their mind whilst they're playing the game, because they are not as elite on defense as they claim to be, and they are not as solid on offense as they claim to be. But clearly, that didn't happen. You saw that despite the Warriors losing that big 16-point lead, they finished the quarter up by 1. And I think it was thanks to a Jordan Poole buzzer beater at the end of the third, which undoubtedly improved his confidence going into the fourth, knowing that he was the one to put the Warriors up by 1. But where I tip my hat off to Golden State is when talking about the veteran leadership being able to keep everybody composed and calm to a point where they can say that despite they had lost that big lead, vocal players like Draymond Green and Andre Iguodala were able to help the team understand how great they are, why they are in the finals, and that they can easily obtain the lead as quickly as they lost it. And as you can see by the box score, they won by almost as many points as they blew. So yeah, I hope that analogy made sense, and you can understand that despite them not being a young, youthful team with veterans at the forefront, It just goes to show you that sometimes basketball can be a mind over body type of game. So now that we've reached the halfway point of the episode, let's move on to why the Boston Celtics lost. In my opinion, the sole reason as to why they didn't come away with a victory was because of Jason Tatum. Now, from the box score, Jason Tatum is their primary scorer. He is the one who put up the most points in that game. So how can you say that he's the sole reason as to why they lost? And for that, I'm going to take it back to the very, very opening minutes of the game. He went scoreless in the first 7 minutes of the first quarter. And if you're thinking that it's the Warriors' defense affecting his shot making and the overall decisions he made, you would be wrong. He didn't go scoreless because he missed a bunch of shots. He went scoreless because he didn't attempt any shots. And that's a big difference, because what I much rather would have preferred to see was Jason Tatum be aggressive, be assertive, miss some shots, because that's natural with any player, but overall let the opposing team know that you are there. Because it got to a point within those opening minutes of the first quarter, leading up to the 7-minute mark until he eventually scored. It got to a point where the ball game was kind of looking like a 4-on-5. Now you could kind of credit this to the Warriors defense playing active denial, making sure that he didn't even get a touch. But if I was Jason Tatum, if I was a potential finals MVP candidate, I wouldn't care about all of that, because I am the leader of this group. I should be the one to show opposing teams that we are not just a defensive-minded team. And even if I was to miss a couple of shots, at least the threat of my presence would be able to open up opportunities for role players. So let's take it back to Steph for a minute. Steph had a worse performance than Jason Tatum throughout the entirety of Game 5, but did he let that stop him? Absolutely not. Despite him not making a single three-pointer, he was able to still assert his dominance and make his presence felt. Now, what do I think Jason Tatum should have done in this situation? It's a little bit different to the situation in Game 1, but also kind of similar. Not in terms of his overall shooting efficiency, but his ability to play make. He had 13 assists in Game 1 compared to 4 in this game. And you could say that, obviously, in order to do that, the defense has to respect you, respect your shot, respect your drives to the paint, and respect your overall offensive attack. So how can the defense respect you when you haven't even attempted anything yet? So obviously they wouldn't fall for your bait. But this is where I think that's wrong. You're bloody Jason Tatum. You don't think that these guys toss and turn over defensive schemes on how to guard you because they don't respect you. The whole reason why you weren't able to get up a shot was because they respect you. But as the offensive threat that you are, it's your job to break that barrier and make sure that you are useful in other ways apart from scoring. And although, yes, he did come out and score 27 points, ultimately accounting for maybe 3 or 4 of those 3-point makes in the third quarter out of the 9 total that they made consecutively. He was responsible for the majority of those, and I understand that. But the point I'm trying to make is all about momentum and setting the tone. So yes, whilst he was overall aggressive in this game, I believe that had he been aggressive and assertive from the start, the odds would have maybe turned out differently. Do I think they would have won this game? Possibly. But the fact of the matter is that Jason Tatum and the Boston Celtics were a step behind of the Golden State Warriors in terms of offensive assertiveness. And so to me, whilst they did go on that big third quarter run, the momentum wasn't enough to carry them there into the third quarter and into winning this game because they were so lackluster in the first quarter. So if I were the Boston Celtics, yes, I would be pleased with the run that I went on. But to me, it would be a too little, too late kind of situation. The second reason as to why I thought they lost this game, I did mention it in the first half of the episode, and I'll continue to say so now, their 3-point makes. Now, I will preface this by saying that none of the teams shot well in Game 5. In fact, the Boston Celtics actually beat the Golden State Warriors in that regard, shooting 34% when compared to 22% by Golden State. And if you were to take it at face value, looking at the Golden State Warriors shooting 9 out of 43s, 4-0, not 1-4, 43s, you would say that the Golden State Warriors lost confidence in their shooting. But the fact of the matter is that they didn't, because they shot 43s. They stayed true to their identity and they were willing to live and die by the 3. Fortunately, it didn't come back to bite us. But the point I make about the Celtics is I feel like that sort of shooting performance, especially throughout the opening half, really shakes your confidence as a team. Because now when you think about your offensive attack, you can't think about the 3-pointer. Because in a pivotal game like this, efficiency is what you need. So therefore, if the 3-pointer isn't providing you efficiency, you are not going to take it. Now, this isn't so much a critique for Game 5, because as I said, they did outshoot the Warriors. This is more so a critique going forward, because establishing yourself as a team that goes 0 for 12 in the half, you effectively dig yourself a bigger hole, and you simply cannot do that against a team like Golden State, who is known for depth and shooting range. You cannot do that because if you're not able to perform well from outside of the arc, you limit your ability to respond back to them. And as I've said in previous episodes of the podcast, the only way the Warriors are going to win is if they outshoot you. So, although they didn't outshoot you in this game, again, I'm going to say that it was a too little, too late sort of situation that we saw here. An honorable mention as a factor, which can sometimes go under the radar, is their ability to hit free throws. I wanted to make this a point before we get on to our final reason, because the Celtics only shot 68%, or just under, from the free throw line, missing 10 of them. They went 21 of 31. And the reason why I'm going to bring this up is if you see the overall score, how much did they lose by? 10. So the point I'm going to make here, albeit very brief, is you have to be efficient from the line. You have to make those shots. Because in the moment, yes, you may feel like it's insignificant. Let's say you miss 1 or 2 in the first quarter. That's cool, brush it off. That's fine. But when it starts building to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and eventually where they got to 10 missed free throws, how can that not be a factor in you guys losing the game? And the question you guys have to kind of ask yourselves is, had we made those 10 free throws, would we have tied the game up? Would we have sent the game into overtime and potentially won the game? Unfortunately, that will just live on as a shoulda, coulda, would've kind of moment. So that's my honorable mention. Now we go on to our final reason as to why I thought the Boston Celtics lost this game. Overall, for me, it was just mentality. Not to say that they weren't aggressive on both ends of the floor. To me, I saw a problem in the players' ability to keep their composure on foul calls or lack thereof. Whether it be fouls to them or by them, I just felt like players weren't exactly responding well to the overall officiating of the game. And I guess, yes, it does get like that sometimes. Frustration can spill over you. But watching this game as not only a fan, but a viewer in general, it got to a point where I could clearly see a clear problem with the league, which is basically players being too soft. Now, this is a point that I wanted to cover in a separate episode, so I won't go too in depth about certain situations that I've seen over the past couple of years. But what I will say is that it got to a point in the game where players were caring more about arguing with the refs about calls than playing the actual game. And you could see it all over their body language, whether it's feeling defeated, running back on the defensive end, or just ultimately lashing out at one of the officials. I think Marcus Smart in the fourth quarter got teed up for yelling at a ref, despite the Boston Celtics actually having the foul call on Jaylen Brown when he got bumped by Draymond Green. And I can't remember whether it was an actual 3-point attempt, whether they ruled it a 3-point attempt, and then the technical on Marcus Smart led it to only be a side-out play, as opposed to Jaylen Brown going to the line for 3 free throws. The Boston Celtics had an opportunity to seize their momentum back, but instead, Marcus Smart complained about a call, got the technical which led Jordan Poole to go to the line, take the free throw, add an additional point to the box score. And then what does he do the very next play out of so-called frustration? He whacks Jordan Poole in the face. Now granted, that was a little bit of a flop by Poole, but you have to do what you have to do to get a win in some games. And so by getting into Marcus Smart's head, that was overall a smart play by Poole to do, however taboo flopping may be. But yeah, going back to my point, there was just a lot of complaining going on and not enough action from the Celtics players in order for them to win this game. So if you take it from that aspect, were they deserving of winning this game? No. Because the truth of the matter is, no matter how it's going, you still have quarters left to play, minutes left to play. And you have to play them to the best of your ability if you want to win. So by complaining, it does nothing for you except open up the possibility for technicals, therefore slowing down any chances of momentum swings going in your favor. So that is what I believe the Warriors have in terms of an edge over the Boston Celtics when talking about whether a certain team will win the championship. I think that despite the Boston Celtics' ability to run the whole 48 minutes, that mind over body aspect of the game which I spoke about will be key to winning this series. So that's going to wrap up my points. We're now going to go into the summary before we ultimately close off this episode. And to summarize this game, I'm going to go back to a few points that I made and sort of reiterate them as to why they could be turning points throughout the remainder of this playoff series. Let's start off with the obvious 16-point lead that they blew. Do I think that it will happen again? No. Do I think it will be a problem if it happens again in Game 6? Absolutely. And the reason why is because you don't have your home crowd to support you anymore. You are going to hear the cheer of every single Boston fan rooting for you to lose. So in that scenario, you cannot give up any leads that you obtain throughout this game because it will come back to bite you. So in order for you guys to win this game on the road, you have to make sure that the third quarter is yours. Obviously, playing well throughout the entirety of the game is important, but for me, I look at the third quarter as kind of a refresh. Like if you don't perform as well within the first half, you always have an opportunity to reset the outcome in the third quarter. Like if you watch game 4 and how Golden State won that game effectively in the third quarter. They were able to re-establish themselves and essentially break away from the Celtics by that point. And although they did start catching up, you have a greater advantage if you take care of the third quarter, because it makes opposing teams realize that they only have 12 minutes to try and win a game. Whereas if you establish yourself in the first quarter and not for the rest of the game, they have 3 total quarters to get back in it. So in my opinion, the third quarter is the best time, the best opportunity for teams to win a game. And overall, the Warriors are outperforming the Celtics in the third quarter, despite their obvious lackluster performance in Game 5. Another thing I wanted to mention is Boston's 8 or 9 straight made threes of 12 consecutive misses. Do I think that it was a problem in this game? Obviously not, because we won. But do I think that it's a problem going into Game 6? Of course, again, absolutely. Because in my opinion now, you give the Boston Celtics an opportunity to understand that yes, they didn't shoot well in the opening half, but towards the end of the game, they started to light you up. And so as I talk about a too little, too late situation, I think the players understand that. So when they take into account that had they had gone on this run a little bit earlier, the outcome definitely would have been different. And when you're at home, for some reason, the rims just feel more wide open and you are generally, as a player, more comfortable in your home arena. That's a given. And I don't know whether that's because of the fans or whether you just know your spots on the floor a little bit better than you would on the road. But now you're going into uncharted territory. So the question is, how will you respond? And this is the final thing I'm going to say before we cap off this episode. The very last point I'm going to make. Steph Curry going 0 for 9 on 3-point attempts. And when I talk about how will you respond, he's who I'm aiming the question to. How will you respond, Steph Curry? You had a bad shooting night from the 3-point arc, which is arguably your biggest, most famous trait. How are you going to respond? Because now is not the time to lose confidence. Now is not the time to shy away in the moment. Because despite all that I've said about the Celtics not being the greatest team in terms of efficiency from outside of the arc, despite all of that, you can't rely on their 0 for 12 performance, especially when being on the road, in an environment where your opposing team is most comfortable. You can't allow their performance or lack thereof to be an excuse as to how you can get away with not performing as well as you typically do. But surprisingly, I'm not all that worried about how Steph Curry will perform. I know I said that he is known to be sort of lackluster towards tight pressured situations, and I'm not going to back down from that comment. But what I will say is the reason why I'm not so stressed about it is because I know that Steph Curry is a natural born and bred shooter. So he is programmed to shoot. There's no other way around it. And if I were the Boston Celtics, you cannot rely in the same way that Steph cannot rely on your poor 3-point shooting performance. You, in the same sense, cannot think that because he's on the road, because he's got the opposing fans against him, and because he didn't make a shot in Game 5, you cannot go into that game thinking that you will receive the same outcome. Because let's get one thing straight. He is a scoring title holder. He is a back-to-back MVP winner. And he's a 3-point champion. Not once, but twice. And guess who was the only one who stopped him from winning 3. Oh yeah, that's right. Klay Thompson, his teammate. So when you talk about one person underperforming from the 3-point arc, guess what? They come in pairs. So when one person isn't going off, guess who you have to deal with now? Game 6 Klay. And I pray to God that he shows up. Because as of recent, you would know that I've been criticizing Klay on his performances. I think that he rushes his shots and all that stuff. But there's something about his overall psyche when you mention Game 6 that a switch just flips. You saw that in the game against OKC, and you saw that in the recent series against the Raptors before Klay ultimately got hurt. So even if Steph does have a lackluster performance from the 3-point line, which I hope he doesn't, because he's due for another explosion in my opinion. And the reason why I say this is Steph likes to redeem himself from bad performances. Most notably, I believe it was a game against the Lakers where he missed, I don't know how many consecutive threes. I think he went scoreless from 3 in that game. Same as this situation here. What did he do the following game? He broke the record for 13 threes in a game. So yes, I will believe, 100% believe, that Steph is going to redeem himself in Game 6. And even if he doesn't, let me remind you of the current record holder for most threes in a game. Again, his teammate, Klay Thompson, with 14 threes. That's how competitive the Warriors are from the 3-point line. That's where they've established their name from, aside from ball movement. And it would be foolish of you to assume that they're not coming for your head in Game 6. One thing that I will mention before we get out of here is watch out for Andrew Wiggins to go off again. I'm hoping and praying as a fan that he understands his strengths and really attacks the Celtics, gets to the line, because although yes, he will get blocked by players like Robert Williams and Al Horford, that can't affect his confidence when you talk about him being the sole contributor in winning the Larry O'Brien trophy. And also players like Draymond Green. I really hope that he can give it his all and essentially back up all that smack talk that he was saying throughout the majority of this series. But anyways, that's going to wrap up this episode here. If you enjoyed it, make sure to like, comment and subscribe. And also, hit the little bell icon to be notified about when every video gets released. But until then, take care and goodbye.